Bona tarda a tothom. Sorry for this delay. We've been having some technical issues. You know that this conference is held in two languages, English and Spanish. There are two different links on the YouTube channel, one for English, one for Spanish. We will be holding our meeting directly in English ourselves, but turn on for the Spanish channel if you want to listen to our interpreter John in Spanish. So welcome everyone. Again, sorry for this delay. We will have a bit of a shorter session due to this technical problem, but we will proceed, and I'm sure that the session will be extremely interesting because we have two panelists with us who will make it extremely interesting. The first one is Daniela Schwarzer, who's the director of the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP. Second is Yannis Emmanuel, who's director of research at the European Policy Center in Brussels. And we've gathered them both to discuss in these sessions that are part of a cycle that is organized between CIDOB, the Barcelona Center for International Affairs, together with the Club of Rome, Club de Roma, ICIP, and Fundación Cultura de Paz, four organizations working on these events with the support of La Caixa, with the Obra Social La Caixa and Palau Macaya, of a series of events I was saying that have discussed for the last few months polarization in democratic societies. How have democratic societies become increasingly polarized, and which tools are we in a position to put forward to foster dialogue and get out of these polarization dynamics? We've done that at the national level in three different scenarios. We've done that for the UK after Brexit, Italy, and the US. So we've gone from the national to the global, and this is where we're going today. Today, we're transcending as a consequence of coronavirus from the national to the global to discuss these polarization dynamics at the global scene, involving many world powers, increasingly renationalizing their priorities, and of course posing a challenge, if not a threat, to international cooperation, to international dialogue, and to multilateralism as the best way to ensure this multilateral dialogue. So this is where we are today. So we're bringing these sessions to a close, with two remaining sessions still to be happening later on. But for the time being, we have this global discussion, as I was saying, with Daniela Schwarzer and Yannis Emmanuel, who will do a first introduction, both of them, and then we'll move to questions and answers from the audience and some that I might ask myself. So if that is all right, I will start with Daniela. We haven't even had the time to discuss who would come first, but Daniela, is it okay if you come first?
That is fine.
Okay, so Daniela, floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul, for having me tonight. It's a great pleasure to be involved in this conversation, which I think is probably one of the most important ones over the past years, really, because what we see, and you have briefly sketched that out in your introduction, that there are indeed manifold polarizing dynamics, and we are supposed to discuss the global level today, but I think it's also worthwhile shedding a little light on what is happening in the European Union, which is, of course, a prism of multilateral cooperation. Now, one of the questions you gave to us for this brief introduction was whether we observe polarizing dynamics, and I would certainly say yes. And are they new? Probably not. Most of them have been there before the COVID crisis hit the world, but we see in my view, substantial acceleration. And the question that I think we need to answer as Europeans in this discussion, whether we are seeing where this may lead and whether we are prepared to handle it. And I guess from that, we can conclude there's quite a big agenda for Europeans to work on. Now, what do we observe? First of all, we can see that the United States, under the presidency of Donald Trump, continues to undermine structures of international order. And here we see how he has seized the corona crisis to actually pull out of another international organization, the World Health Organization, and has continued his weakening of global governance structures. There's also more polarization between the United States and Europe. And as a German speaking to you from Berlin tonight, of course, there's a very strong discussion going on about the recent statements on a pretty substantive troop withdrawal from Germany of US troops, which is seen as putting pressure on Germany in the NATO context and, yes, using this topic obviously also for domestic purposes. But I'll come to the why. Why do we see this polarization, which was your second question, in a minute. What we also observe is an increasing polarization between the United States and China. And again, this is nothing new, but in the corona crisis, it seems as if there was more for them to chew on and more to build up against each other, rhetorically, but also factually. And if you look at the rhetoric, I mean, the way the United States calls this the Wuhan virus as a provocation to escalate, rhetorically the relationship with China, the way Trump uses this again domestically to work against China and suggest that he is the one who best safeguards American interests in this global pandemic, you can see how a leader uses the situation. And on the Chinese side, we also saw steps of increasing polarization. I will leave it at those observations because we could travel around the world, but I think the pattern is pretty clear. And I would like to come to the why. What we see is that leaders who get under increasing pressure through the health emergency and the pandemic, there are essentially two reflexes which we see in a number of countries, in particular those countries where crisis management doesn't necessarily work very well. One is to use external relations to scapegoat, to identify a culprit, and to, use the external agenda to be able to build a case domestically that one is the strong leader and is actually doing the best that is in the country's interest. But there's a second development which also speaks to the questions that you have set out for us, and that is how do authoritarian leaders actually also use the crisis for their domestic agenda. And then we can see that a number of authoritarian leaders or those who are on track for such a regime change in their own country have used the COVID-19 crisis to actually strengthen their grip on power, be it through emergency laws, which were newly passed, or be it by reinforcing their grip on civil society, but also media and others. So what we observe here, and this is a big danger for us in Europe, is that leaders on our doorstep have first tried to ignore the crisis and have published numbers that were not credible in terms of infection rates, in terms of testing, and so on, and have hence tried to cover up a mishandling of the health emergency. And as this becomes all the more apparent that it is not possible for them to contain the spread of the virus, they have partially turned on to, again, their own civil societies, their own media, and so on to cover up this development. And for Europe, this simply means there's a growing risk that the pandemic, without transparency, can't be contained because it's obviously a transnational threat, which needs a transnational answer. And here I am coming to my last point because we have to be shorter because of the limited time we have. Just a brief comment on what we saw happening in Europe. And here actually, I guess the story we can tell by now is one where reason has come back in and cooperation and the spirit of cooperation has won over the first reaction, which was a rather national one. If you look at the way the COVID-19 pandemic has led governments to take first very national steps in the management of the health crisis, you can actually see how fragile the whole setup of the European Union is. The way export controls were implemented, the way borders were pulled up again, the way there was a very clear lack of solidarity with those countries who were hit first by the virus, namely Italy, Spain, but then also France. So the first weeks were really a very sobering experience when it comes to the European dimension of handling this emergency. But what we see now is that there's a very good understanding that we need a joint trans-European answer to this challenge, not only in the big task to contain the virus and work towards a management of the virus through vaccinations and possibly one-day treatments, but also that we need to strengthen the EU's capacity to actually, in a future crisis, be able to provide the necessary protection, so we don't see a dismantling of what the EU is, namely a space where people can move freely. So if you create the space, but at the same time you're not able to protect the citizens that move freely, it is obvious that it comes back to national answers. And so this is a realization which I think is very important. But bringing this to the global topic we are supposed to discuss tonight, I think Europe has the potential with this realization to play, and it must play, a stronger international role, as the US, as I described, is pulling out and China is trying to implement its expansive global dominance agenda, not only in the field of health. Europeans have a keen interest to play a stronger role in reshaping and strengthening structures of international order. I'll leave it there. I'm happy to come back to those points in the discussion.
Thank you, Daniela. Because one of the things that we are very much interested in these discussions we've been having so far is seeing the ways in which dialogue can work better. And you seem to draw a clear line between the possibility of acting at the global level with being functional, and that institutions work in the benefit of this dynamic. So probably one way to foster dialogue is precisely to make institutions work, and to make institutions work for a proper purpose. And that includes, of course, the European Union, which is certainly the in principle best equipped machinery for these sort of dialogues, but sometimes failing to do so, or at least acting below expectations. So I'll move immediately to Brussels, to Yannis, for this vision from the center of Europe, if Berlin enables us to call Brussels the center of Europe in this regard. But Yannis, the floor is yours. For those who are listening into Spanish, apparently there are some problems, but remember that there's always the possibility to follow this discussion through the YouTube channel in English, which is where we are now. So Yannis, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paula. Thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me, for giving me the chance to be with you and to be with the audience and to share some of my thoughts. What I want to do is to provide, in addition to Daniela's food for thought, some my own thoughts on where we stand and which direction we might be moving. And I want to do that by making one short preliminary general point, and then three more specific remarks. Two with respect to the external dimension, and one with respect to the internal dimension, also concentrating on the issue of polarization, which you also were indicating in the introduction. With respect to my preliminary general point, it's a word of caution. I think we need to be very careful when we analyze the current situation in light of the current COVID-19 crisis, and very careful when we make predictions, both with respect to the internal future developments and external future developments. I say that because we are very early on in the crisis. And I think we've seen often very hasty judgments, very hasty conclusions which have been drawn, and also some hasty prognosis of what might happen in future. And as I said, the crisis is still in early phases, it's still unfolding. And I think we should be humble, because in many ways we are agnostic. We do not know where we will be in 3, 6, 9 months, a year's time. And if you look at the different dimensions and consequences, potential consequences of the crisis, we are still very much focusing on the public health crisis, on the economic consequences, but there are also potential societal consequences within, between countries, political consequences, which we cannot be fully aware of, and obviously the geoeconomic and geopolitical consequences. And we've seen a lot of people already predicting what might happen. People have been talking about the end of globalization. Some have been saying that's the end of capitalism as we know it. At the European level, people have been saying the end of the European Green Deal, or even the end of the EU. So I think we need to be very humble and careful when we try to make predictions. And I think many of these radical predictions, which we hear at the end, will not prove themselves correct. Now, my first specific remark with respect to the global dimension, which reflects on some of the things which Daniela has already said. The crisis is obviously a catalyst and an accelerator of existing trends. At the global level, we already saw that there was a tendency towards an increasing geopolitical, geoeconomic polarization. So what we're seeing now intensifying is not really a new development. The COVID crisis is pushing it quicker, and it's pushing it further in terms of the polarization at the international level. And as Daniela was already alluding or hinting towards, the US elections and the circumstance that the pandemic started in China doesn't help to de-escalate. On the contrary, we see a further escalation, especially between the US and China. And this is a trend which we have been observing over the past year, and now we've seen that it is accelerated. From the European perspective, that means I think that it's likely that we will get squeezed, between the US and China, that we might also be increasingly forced to position ourselves. We might be forced to take some very tough decisions as Europeans, tough choices. And the unity among Europeans might also be tested when these tough situations occur. On the other hand, it might push us together. Again, we need to be humble. We do not know, but there is the danger that we will be further squeezed and further be divided among ourselves. This second remark goes with respect to the EU's external role. Given that we seem to be seeing that there's an increasing geopolitical, geoeconomic polarization, what that should force us to do, I think, is rather obvious. We should assume more responsibility in our direct neighborhood at the global level. We should speak with one voice. We should act jointly on the ground, even in difficult situations. But will we actually do that? In the increasing polarized world, there are opportunities for Europe to enhance its external influence, its external role. There is a space between a polarized US and China which we can fill. But the problem and the challenge is that in order for us Europeans to fill that space, and Paul, you were talking about functioning institutions and governance systems, we need a functioning multilateral system in order for us Europeans to be able to play the role, to fill that space I was talking about. But we've seen, and Daniela was alluding to that the international governance system is under pressure because of COVID-19. We've observed a lack of coordination at the level of G7, G12. We've seen the problems with respect to the World Health Organization. Other institutional fora are under pressure. So the multilateral system is under pressure. But what I fear most with respect to the external role is that because of the crisis, because of the multiple potential consequences of it, that we Europeans might enter another phase of what I would call the phase of introspection, where the world around us is massively changing, and we are again dealing with ourselves. I think this is a danger, that we might struggle to agree on decisive, timely reactions internally. Daniela is right. In the beginning, we entered this crisis in a very chaotic fashion. Now we cooperate much more. But as the crisis becomes, and the consequences of it become more severe potentially in future, there is a danger that we will be dealing with ourselves, while the outside world is changing just in front of our eyes. And these divisions among ourselves might make it more difficult for us to cooperate at the international level. The third remark is related to the internal dimension. Although it's difficult to distinguish between the internal and the external because they're so interlinked with each other. And the key word, as I said earlier, I want to focus on is polarization. Polarization not at the global level, but polarization within Europe, also within our national societies. And I think the polarization within our society has an effect also on the fragmentation between member states in the European Union. Again, polarization is not a new phenomenon. We've seen an increase of polarization over time. It is more of a trend. And it is a trend which is playing into the hands of what people, and what we should probably call authoritarian, nationalistic, my country comes first populists. The polarization of our societies is playing into their hands. And we've seen this in Europe. We see it globally if we look across the Atlantic, across the pond. So it's not only a European phenomenon. But my fear is that the underlying reason for the polarization within our societies might increase because of the crisis. What I mean is that if we look into the reasons of why we see an increasing polarization, I think that's linked a lot to the multiple insecurities which people fear about the future. People fear, many in our societies fear change. They fear that if things change, they might be the losers of change. And this crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, could create more losers, or the impression that potentially one might become a loser. That is within our societies, but also among and between our society, between member states. And these people who fear change and fear that they might be losing out because of these insecurities become an easy prey. They become an easy prey for populists who are suggesting easy solutions, who are coming up with simplistic, my country comes first attitudes and principles. So I would be careful, because a lot of people have been cheering that populists are not really doing well in the first phase of the corona crisis. Looking towards the US, Turkey, Russia, Brazil, but also within the EU member states, a lot of people arguing that the mainstream is performing rather well. But I think we need to be careful in cheering too early, because of the underlying reason for polarization within our societies because of the crisis increases. I think this is a problem which will not undermine our ability to collectively act at European level, but it also could undermine our ability to work at the global level, which is something where I think every one of us is clear that we need to work more. But the polarization globally and internally can be a massive challenge for that level of cooperation among us. I'll keep it there, and I hope it provided some food for thought.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Yannis, because you raised a very important issue, which are the underlying trends behind this polarization. We often tend to look at the expressions of polarization. Who is the polarizer? Which sort of language do the polarizers use? The "my country first" recipe, and so on and so forth. But of course, this is the image of the world we live in. You clearly mentioned the idea that there are some insecurities, underlying trends behind this polarization that you mentioned have not gone away or are still among us. And I would add to this, probably they are of cumulative nature, because yes, we have been going from crisis to crisis to crisis, and thus the underlying insecurities in our societies that are expressed or that find their channels of expressions through polarization it's not only that they are there, it's still that they are growing and growing as we add another layer of crisis to what we're witnessing. And coronavirus, for it being a global crisis, is clearly a case in point. And this is what I would like to bring you to now in the last 20 minutes or so that we have for discussion here. Are we, the fact of this being a global phenomenon, and we are all aware, global not only because it's global in worldwide phenomenon, also because it's global in the social, in the economic, in the political, in the personal, in the health dimension, in any dimension, it's also a global crisis. Does this, or why hasn't this, let me put it this way, led to a new momentum for understanding globality in the world we live in? Is this any foreseeable sort of trend that might emerge after some time when we realize that these "my country first" recipes don't necessarily work? What are the prospects for the global governance, for global cooperation as you see them now? Or this question or any other questions that you might want to react to, Daniela, out of anything that Yannis has said as well.
First of all, let me agree with Yannis that it's very early to say, and I fully share your concern that, opinion poll data shows us these days that in many countries, populists who were seemingly on the rise have stalled or even declined in terms of support. But this is in no way something we can just be relaxed about and say this is not going to be a future problem. I think the degree of uncertainty that people feel is increasing basically by the day or week as we see the economic data and the prospects for employment and social security being shattered. And we also need to acknowledge that this will not play out in a symmetric way. If I just look at Europe, it's obvious that not only between countries, but also within countries, the socio-economic effects of this crisis will vary greatly. And this is why it is so important to not let only national governments step in the economic recovery initiatives, but really have a trans-European approach to this. Because otherwise, my fear really is that both economic divergence, social tensions, but then also political polarization will strongly increase. So I think it's really, Chancellor Merkel, who will take the EU presidency on July 1st, she said this is an existential moment for the European Union, which some may have felt is exaggerated. But I think if we look at what is happening on the ground now and we extrapolate this where it might put us all in maybe 6 months' time, we should be very aware of really decisive European action that will be needed to hold the club together. On your question, why does this obvious global challenge doesn't bring about a leap forward in terms of global cooperation? I guess we have, at this point in time, too many leaders who have made it a building block of their programmatic approach to politics to emphasize the national and the sovereignty element. And if you take Trump's terms, making America great again, and this means in his narrative to pull America out of institutions that just free ride on the United States back. And if that is the narrative of a leader, obviously in a pandemic where you get under growing pressure domestically, it's not easy to make a U-turn, and probably this president won't make a U-turn. But I do see that there is a very strong awareness, not only in terms of handling the pandemic, that there needs to be global action, and it's not the usual suspects stepping forward. I mean, some of course are, some governments which have a strong tradition in multilateral cooperation do step forward, but you also see that, for instance, the German government, more or less since Trump got elected into office, has built their initiative for stronger multilateralism, not on the only traditional ties, but rather look for partners in other places of the world who share this interest. So we definitely see shifts, but I wouldn't say that in general we see a decline in interest in global cooperation. But of course, and we discussed institutions earlier on, there is a question mark as to which of the post-World War II global institutions that were built are actually fit for purpose in this new world. And the discussion about reforming, let's say, the US crafted order of the Bretton Woods institutions and the United Nations, recrafting this now under the conditions of a pandemic is of course extremely difficult, but we know and have known for probably since the 1990s, this discussion has been going on, that at some point the order needs to be adjusted to give those who are rising powers more weight and more say in these institutions. And what we've seen over the past years is a building of alternative regional orders. That, for instance, Chinese-led initiatives have produced competition in terms of institutions, like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank as the most prominent and most broadly discussed example. And so here we are in this pandemic, and I think the question really is whether cooperation can be ensured using the existing institutions, but also bringing in new actors who can help. And this help also means financially help, because one of the big losses that the international order, of course, has to digest is the withdrawal of US funding from some of them. And here we see moves from civil society, for instance, big foundations who put a lot of money on the table and say, here we are, for instance, for the development of vaccinations or other initiatives. there's mobilization. If you take climate, again, the pattern is not uncomparable. The US pulling out, pulling into question the whole setup, and then you see new actors emerging. In this case, subnational actors, take governors, take mayors of big cities in the United States, take corporate leaders who say, but we will stick to the goals anyway. So my sense is that we are in a transition phase of the international system, and there is a high risk that we have less of order and less of structure, and hence, let's say, more complex conditions for consensus building and interest mediation between governments. But at the same time, we see civil society and the corporate sector realizing that they need to take more responsibility. So we are at this moment in uncharted waters, and definitely at a moment where we will probably which we might look back at and say, this was a turning point. But in my view, it is a moment where things can still be influenced the way they develop further. And, just yesterday I participated in a German conference, which is, priority for the German presidency, not only of the European Union, but also of its time as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, which is linking the climate agenda to the security agenda, which, in different ways have both been considerably pushed by the COVID-19 situation. And there is, I would say, very clear multi-level thinking of how can we use the United Nations, how can we use other multilateral fora, how can we use the EU to advance a multinational agenda. But most of all, in this stage where the US is dropping out, it is about finding partners who will push that agenda together, because no European country alone can move anything. So the EU is an important actor and forum for governments to line up. But this agenda goes far beyond Europe, of course, and partners have to be, found where they are.
Thank you, Daniela, and I'm sure. Thank you very much. I'm sure that Yannis, you will have a lot to say about what Daniela just mentioned now. But there is a question that comes from the audience that I would like to raise to you, and maybe incorporate into your answer, because it relates to the introspection that you mentioned in your initial remarks, Yannis. And is, to what extent can political leaders be tempted to use fear as a tool for gaining support, and thus taking advantage of the emotions that fear generates to impose a certain agenda? And I think it was also Daniela at the beginning that mentioned the illiberal turn that we were witnessing. But Yannis, floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll insert that into my last point. I want to make three rather quick points. The one relates to something, Paul, which you said in reaction to what I had said when you were saying that we are piling things up. The situation is getting worse, crisis by crisis. And I think that this is a very valid point. Actually, this is why I believe that what we're currently witnessing as in what we call the COVID-19 crisis, with all its multiple dimensions to which I was referring to earlier, actually is just is a wrong word, but I'll still stick to it, a new phase of what some of us had called some years ago the pulley crisis. Starting with Lehman, with the euro area crisis, including the Greek crisis to it, being half Greek, I know what that was all about. The migration crisis, the challenges we had in our relationship and have with Russia, if you look at the Ukraine crisis. So we've gone through many different crises, and they were all in many ways interlinked. And I think we should add in our thinking the current crisis to that series of crises, which at that time, and I think we should continue calling it the poly crisis, because there is a lot of collateral damage which have been caused by these crises. And we see that people, also our citizens, remember what have happened in the past. Take the example of the ESM. Should we use the ESM and potential loads from the ESM? People feel, oh, this means that we're going to have the same fate as the Greeks had, who were told for years of what to do, and austerity was the recipe of the day. I'm simplifying because the reality was more complex, but this is just one example how these crises are related with each other, and they're linked to each other. And that's, if we look at it from that perspective, we see that the current challenge is even more difficult than simply looking at COVID-19 and the immediate potential consequences of it. The second point refers to the question you were raising. We have a global crisis, it's a global phenomenon. Why are we not cooperating at the global level, enough? And I think the answer to that, obviously, is, as all to simple questions, the answers are always complex. But I think there's one thing I would respond to that, which is that old trends, which we see had started before the crisis erupted, are being fostered, the crisis acts as a catalyst. So the fact that we have a confrontation an increasing one, between the US and China is something which is not new, and the crisis is fostering it. And that means that we find ourselves also as Europeans in a situation where reverting to another logic, just because now we have this global crisis, and just because the smartest thing to do would be to increase global cooperation, to reform our global governance structures, to reform the global order, the structures so that they reflect the new global order situation, is something which is extremely difficult if you have one power which feels that it is threatened, and another one which is increasing its power and wants to play that role. So, but that's a mega development which we're not seeing over the past months, over the past years. So just because this crisis is happening, reverting to a logic which might make sense, I think is something where, I'll use a tough word, where we probably would be naive, because the bigger underlying trend is bigger than the necessity of logic. Unfortunately, we do not always operate by logic. And if you look forward, Daniela was referring a lot to the US. After the US elections, in case, and I think most of us hope that this will not be the case, there would be Trump too, I think the situation would deteriorate. I think also that a new Trump administration, which would be in its last 4 years if that would happen, would probably try to split us Europeans up even more. And might also be more confrontation with respect to Europe, but also try to split us up even more, which will be something which we then have to react to. But even if Joe Biden wins and we have a Biden administration, we might be confronted with the fact that you might have someone in office who might be saying, I'm ready to cooperate more when it comes to Paris climate change objectives, when it comes to Iran, when it comes to also reforming global governance structures maybe. But at the same time, I think even a Biden administration will be asking us, what's your position on China, by the way? So we're ready to engage more. We're going to be multilateral. But what are you going to do with respect to the problems we're facing with China on issues A, B, and C? How will you position yourself? This is where we will be squeezed. And I hope that we will, as Europeans, be smart enough to fulfill this in-between role, which I would have assumed without the global pandemic would have happened anyway, but now it might come earlier. That's going to be a severe challenge. And my last point relates to the introspection and to European cooperation. Daniela is very right when she says that we need at European level to cooperate more. And I think the upcoming weeks and months will be important with respect to finding an agreement on the multi-annual financial framework, on the recovery plan, the recovery instrument, the recovery facility. Because if we don't find that agreement, we will be sending out a very negative signal. And that signal will be that when it comes to the really tough decisions, member states are not able to come to an agreement. I don't think that that will happen. I think that we will see that chances are even higher than they were a couple of weeks ago, that we will come to an agreement. But if we wouldn't, I think we would see a severe deterioration of the situation. A lot of people asking themselves, what do we need the EU for? Why is it relevant? We will also see even more increasing pressures on the single market, because there are distortions which we're witnessing in the single market and increasing divergencies within the economic divergencies within the European Union. And I think that that effect would actually lead us to a very negative scenario. And then Angela Merkel would be right when she said that this is an existential threat or moment. I don't think that we're now in an existential crisis. I think we're at a fundamental crisis. There's a danger that we might get to an existential crisis. And if we are not able to deliver on the most important issues, including the MFF and the Recovery Fund, that would mean that we will be dealing with ourselves for a long time. This is where introspection then comes in. We will not be able to think, what does all that mean with respect to the global dimension, but we will be dealing with ourselves. That's exactly a fear I have. And I hope we will avert that, because it would be stupid.
Absolutely. Daniela, I know you have to leave very soon, so I'll give you the last floor for any comments that you want to add on what has been said so far, or address the issue of fear politics that was raised also before.
Oh, yes.
Yes, I think there is an already existing tendency to play around with fears also, in European countries, but you can see it basically around the world. And as, the future seems more and more unpredictable and risky, this makes it easier for illiberal, autocratic, whatever they are, forces to play with that fear and to spin their narrative, which is often comparable from country to country, that they are the ones who will protect, that they are the ones who own solutions, and that these responses are national ones and not, trans-European or global ones. So this, I think this trend is clearly there, and the situation can be very easily exploited. I believe it's much easier now to spin an anti-European story based on fear than spinning a story which is about our joint future and an easy way forward to build this joint future. But it's absolutely necessary that we work on that. And part of that story, why we need Europe today, is also one about what happens in the world around us and what we should be worrying about. And I guess what we feel now is that as we have lived with the COVID-19 crisis for a number of months, some feel a certain fatigue and say, well, it's summertime and, things are slowly coming back to normal. But Yannis said that earlier, we are at the beginning of a crisis, and the economic effects of this will only be felt in the coming month. And then we will see the social and political repercussions of these economic effects. And the big political task, in my view, really is to develop a forward-looking narrative, how cooperation between countries in the European context, but also globally, can actually offer solutions and can credibly be a way forward that we can handle those crises which we are confronted with. Because it's always easy to tell a story that if you bring, home the competence and you regain sovereignty and you do it all by yourself, you will be able to provide security and protection to your citizens. But given the way the world is today, this is not a winning plan, but it's a big danger to the achievements which we already have. And, for us, I guess it was not to be expected 5 years ago that this notion of international multilateral cooperation would actually be challenged by a certain number of players, which we call our closest allies, and again, back at the United States. So this is, I think, the biggest political challenge, to devise this way forward and actually invent new mechanisms and use the old ones to provide solutions to those problems and bring that home. And I think the interesting thing about the COVID-19 crisis from an analytical perspective is it's a global pandemic, which doesn't mind any border and just spreads. However, the effects can be felt on the local level, absolutely locally. And the same is true for the climate crisis. It's a global crisis by definition, but the people who suffer are very local, and they have their own observations, what this means for their life. If, that food security is no longer provided, that they have to move because of the effects. And this link between local and global is something that, in my view, needs to be explored more in the way our institutions work, and the way, when we see there is a global crisis, we think about multilateralism, because it's not only bringing governments together. I said earlier on, it's also about bringing subnational and civil society actors together, but it's also about a strategy that bridges the very, very local help that needs to be provided and the very global response and prevention of a deterioration of the situation. So I think the topic that you are raising today is one that will be with us for a very, very long time, because the challenges we are facing can only be tackled in multilateral ways. But at the same time, if they are not handled well on the local level, we will have all the negative political effects we've been discussing.
Absolutely. That's a very acute observation, and I totally agree with you, Daniela. I know you have to leave. Yannis may have something to say, so if you have to leave, it's fine. It's perfectly fine. I want to thank you very much, Daniela, for your patience in the waiting for us to solve the technical problem and your availability to participate in this. I'm sure we will have occasions to further discuss these issues. As you rightly mentioned, they'll be with us for a long, long time. So thank you very much, Daniela, and see you next time. I give the last word to Yannis for very last remarks, and then we'll close it here. Thank you, Daniela.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Daniela. I'll come forward with a bit more of a positive attitude. I think we've been very negative, and I used the notion of fear, to say something which at the end might be more positive than some of the things we've been discussing over the past hour. Yes, the fear factor is something which often plays into the hands of some who are pushing our societies in a certain negative direction. And the fear of insecurity, economic insecurity, societal insecurities, identity insecurities, I think it is a challenge. However, fears and concerns are also very much unifiers. We've seen that when the Brexit referendum took place. We saw it when Trump came to power. There was a fear that might have strong negative repercussions on the EU as a collective entity, but also individually, that Brexit might only be the start of a domino effect, that Trump might be something which will divide us and lead to more of that sort coming to power maybe in Europe. So it has been a unifying element, and the fear and the concern of things moving in the wrong direction has brought us together. And I think if you look at the COVID-19 crisis and you compare it to the beginning of the polio crisis, to the beginning of the euro area crisis, if you go back to 2010, we at the time were not aware of what was happening. I remember very vividly in the first 6 months of 2010, we actually weren't even understanding that what was happening in front of our eyes would develop into such a fundamental crisis we experienced further down the road. We thought that Greece is just a small country in the periphery of Europe, less than 2% of our European economy. We can control the problem. It then spread to Ireland and Portugal. We said we can limit it to these 3 countries. And then we saw things getting slowly out of control. And it took us until 2012, more than 2 years, for the ECB to come up with the whatever it takes moment, and then the situation improved. Today, the reaction to the COVID-19 crisis, the nature of which is very different from the other crises, is very different. We very early on understood the potential negative consequences. So we were fearful of what might happen with respect to the COVID-19 crisis, how it might develop, which I think is one reason why member states are ready to we use that word, the bazooka on the table, and to say, we need to do something which is of a certain magnitude in order to stop the worst potential scenario from materializing. The fact that the ECB on the 18th of March, this was the speed of light compared to where we were in 2010, 2012, came up with a bond buying program PEP of a big magnitude. Since then it has been increased and it has been prolonged, was something which many were not expecting. It happened very quickly. without the political support. The ECB itself decided that it's necessary to do so. If we get together our act with respect to the multi-year budget of the European Union and the recovery plan, I think this will be of a certain magnitude. I don't think that will be enough, but it will be of a certain magnitude. So what I want to say is that sometimes fears and concerns are unifiers, and if you compare the current situation to previous crises, actually the track record up till now is not too negative. Yes, the beginning was chaotic. It was everyone dealing with oneself. Everyone was overwhelmed. Even, by the way, federal national states were overwhelmed and didn't know how to coordinate within a nation state, if I look at my half home country, which is Germany. So I wasn't surprised about the initial phase of the crisis, but since then, I think we've understood that only if we cooperate, if we act at national level very fiercely, and if we cooperate at European level, can we avert the worst of potential negative outcomes. So here, I think concerns and fears is something which pushes us in the right direction. The question is whether we will have the courage, we will have the stamina to push this through. And that is something which is too early to say.
Thank you, Yannis. Thank you very much, because you ended up on a positive note, which is always very much appreciated, because there's light at the end of the tunnel, or at least we might be able to see some light at the end of the tunnel to nuance it a bit more. But in any case, thank you very much for that note. We've reached the end of our discussion of this seminar that was organized in the framework of an initiative to discuss polarizing dynamics, but also dialogue and how to get out of these polarizing dynamics. And I come out with a few conclusions. First is that we need things to work in order to stop polarization, or to disentangle the effects of polarization. As Daniela mentioned at the beginning, I mean, the dysfunctionality within institutions is one of the main issues that should be fixed if we are to solve this. And second, you mentioned, Yannis, also the fact that the insecurity is lying behind, and the factors that lead to polarized politics need to be fixed somehow. So people need to fear that these working institutions not only work but work in their favor. And finally, your last note on the need to reverse fear politics by understanding that fear leads to change and can eventually lead to some unifying and more rapid reactions. And this is where probably we're at the global level. And it's still certainly too early to call whether these positive effects will unfold, or whether we will look back and say this was a failure of global cooperation at the time that it was most needed. But for this, we will certainly have to meet again at some point in the future and rediscuss and see where we're at. And also gather together with the Club de Roma and ICIP and Fundación Cultura de Paz, and hopefully with the support of La Caixa, to have this series of discussions again, that this time was held in English, but we will do the best we can to post it in Spanish with a simultaneous interpretation as well, so that people can go back to the YouTube channel and go back to the discussions we were having. But Yannis, thank you very much for your time, for your participation. Sorry as well for the technical hiccup at the beginning of the session.
Thank you.
These things happen, but thank you all very much, and all those who had the patience to bear with us at the beginning and waiting for this to go online. So